in the middle of the 20th century, there was kind of the age of experiments before ethical standards. One of them was the Milgram experiments with the shocks. But another maybe more ethical one was the Asch conformity experiments. And the experiments went a little bit like this. 6 participants were taken into a room, and they were shown a card like this one. And they had a very simple task to do together. On the left, exhibit 1 was a line, and they needed to figure out which line in exhibit 2 matched the line in exhibit 1. So they would say A. A matches the exhibit 1. It's a very simple task. But here's the catch. Out of the 6 people in this room, out of the 6 participants, 5 of them were assistants. They weren't random people off the street. Only person number 5 was. Does that make sense? So out of the 6 people sitting there, there was only one person who was actually the subject of the experiment. And so they would show these cards. And these cards were pretty simple, as you can see. And so they would go down the line and they would say, participant number 1, which line matches? And they would answer. Participant number 2, which line matches? And so on and so forth. The first 5 or 6 cards that they did were simple cards that everyone answered correctly. But the experiment really got started when the rest of the assistants all started choosing a different answer. So they might look at this card and they might say, and participant number 1 would say, I think it's B. And participant number 2 would say, it's B. And 3 would say, it's B. 4 would say, it's B. And then when it gets to participant number 5, the person who's really the one on trial here, they wouldn't know what to do because their eyes would tell them, no, it's definitely A. But really, everyone else had just said B, so maybe they're wrong? Do they just want to go with the group? So in 37% of instances, the people would defy their own eyes and answer with the rest of the group. 37% of the time, which is significant. Now, when they did variations on this experiment, they got that number way down. For example, if there was a partner that they could rely on to tell the truth, then they would be more inclined to as well. Or if they could write their answer in secret, they were more likely to tell the truth. But it's just when the pressure of the crowd was on them that they were most likely to conform. Now, conformity is something we all do to a certain degree. And sometimes it has no consequence at all. Other times it has major consequences. And it's moments when people stop being conformist, when they take a stand for something, that we really stop and take note. So this is Rosa Parks. And she was one of those nonconformists. One day, December 1st, 1955, she decides that she is not going to sit where she is supposed to sit on the bus. She's going to sit somewhere else. Now, that act is, well, small and insignificant, except it turned into a catalyst for really kicking off the civil rights movement. The story we have for today, the story of Rahab, I might argue, is just another example of one of these tales. So, before we get into the story, let me just make a couple of points about this story. This is a story that may be unfamiliar to you. In the church, we use something called the lectionary. It is a series of readings that repeats every 3 years. So you might have a lectionary for this year, and then it'll come up 3 years from now, the exact same readings. And this is great because we really get to focus in depth on a lot of readings, but the downside is it doesn't cover all of the scripture. And so when I went looking for this, reading in the lectionary, it's nowhere. It's not the kind of story that's preached on very often, if only because it's not in the lectionary. So that being said, let's find ourselves in the narrative. The people have escaped Egypt under the guidance of Moses. They've wandered through the desert. They've had those encounters in the wilderness with the law and with water from a rock. And finally, they're on the precipice of the promised land when Moses dies. He's not allowed to continue into the promised land. Somebody else takes over. His name is Joshua. And so this story for today takes place in the book of Joshua. It is the 6th book in our scriptures. And the people have crossed the river and are now going into the promised land. But we know, and we've actually talked about this before, that the promised land is not an untouched valley of milk and honey, but rather an occupied civilization well underway. And why wouldn't it be? It has great farmland and wonderful places to raise your kids. But here, the Israelites are coming across the river and looking to carve out their own space in this place. Now, in order to do that, they go to war and essentially try to vanquish everyone in their way. And one of the tools in their tool chests is to send spies into the communities that they wish to conquer. So they send 2 spies to a place called Jericho. Now, in the story for today, we don't have many details about the city of Jericho. What we know about Jericho actually comes a couple of chapters later. We find that the walls of this city are the best in the land, impenetrable. And so Jericho is probably a very formidable city on the map. So these 2 spies go into Jericho during the day, disguised as traders or maybe lost wayfarers looking for a way home. And they come into the city. I assume they scope it out. And they decide that they're going to stay at the house of Rahab, who is a prostitute. The gate of Jericho closes around sunset. And it's at that point when panic starts to come into the city, because they realize that maybe those 2 people who came might just be spies. And Rahab gets word of this, and she hides them on her roof under some flax that is drying. And people come knocking on her door, and they're looking for these 2 spies. And Rahab says, well, they were here, but they left before the gate was closed. You should go after them. Now, the text says that they then opened the gate, which I can only imagine is an important detail. They let down the gates when it was dark, sent out some people to go find these 2 spies on the road. And after everything has calmed down, the authorities have gone, Rahab goes up to the roof, and she says to these 2 spies, look, I have heard rumors of what is happening when you come to this land. We have heard what happens when your God splits the sea and comes in, and we've heard what happens to kingdoms who don't capitulate. And I believe that our city, in the sight of your army, will fall. So when that day happens, when that day comes, please spare my family and I, my mother, my father, and my siblings. And their response is, your lives for ours. Like, we're happy we're not dead, because right now we should be in the king's dungeons. So after the story that we read for today, Rahab lets them out through a window in the wall. Her house happens to be adjacent to it, and she lets down this long red cord, and these spies are free to go. It's a remarkable story. She's one of the few women that's mentioned in Hebrews when it's talking about what does a faithful person look like. And there is Rahab. So what are we supposed to do with a story like this? Well, I think one of the things we're not supposed to do is treat this story with a celebratory tone. And here's why. This story, in all its glory, is colonialism at its finest. One group of people goes into another land, wipes out everyone who's there so they can call it their home. Does that sound familiar? It should. So instead of treating this story with great celebration, I do believe it is a cautionary tale against that. But more importantly, I think it's a wonderful metaphor. So the people and the land and Jericho and Rahab, what if they are symbolic? Which I would argue they are. What if the people represent truth? In the story, they're labeled the Israelite army, the Israelite people. But instead of seeing them as an army, what if we just see them as truth? And what if we saw the promised land is the possibility of everything that this world could be when peace and justice reign? And what if Jericho is a symbol of things gone wrong? When things aren't right. You see, cities like Jericho that manage to build massive, impenetrable walls often have a thing in common with many other institutions. And that's that there are people at the top who are quite well off. And then there are people at the bottom who fall through the cracks. I would defy you to find an example of an institution where that doesn't happen. And so we have this city on this plain, which maybe represents the things that are wrong with this world. And then we have Rahab, and by all accounts, Rahab is treasonous in this story. She is denying her own people. She is essentially subjecting them to what comes next. And yet, there's something incredible about what she does. What if she is standing up? What if she is the odd person out? What if she's the one who says that the lines that everyone else says are equal are not? What if she's the whistleblower? What if she's the person who recognizes that this is not the way it should be, that we need to bow to something else? When I think about this act of Rahab, what strikes me is how similar it is to something that Rosa Parks did. It's such a small act, but it acts as a catalyst for something greater to come. So when I think of the stories of Jesus, I often think that that's exactly what he did too. He goes and he talks to a woman at the well. And yeah, that's so incredibly ordinary. But it's nonconformist, and it changes everything. So the question I have for you is, can you think of an area in your life in which you need to be courageous? Maybe you're sitting for coffee with some people and somebody tells a homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic joke that isn't funny. And your reaction is often just to laugh along. Maybe you can be a little bit more like Rahab and say, hold on a second. I'm not going to go along with that anymore. Maybe you see somebody throwing trash out their window when you're driving down the highway, or texting while they drive. Rather than just letting it go, maybe we need to be a little bit more courageous. Or maybe we sit in a meeting where something's happening and we recognize that what's happening is not right, and it's not good, and it's not just. And so while everyone else seems to be going along with it, what if we speak up? What if we were bold and courageous? There's a quote, and I'm not sure if it's from the Dalai Lama or somebody else, but it says, if you think you are too small to make a difference, try sleeping in a tent with a mosquito. May you have that kind of courage. I saw this picture once, painted on some derelict house in some city that's been ravaged by the spoils of empire. It says, speak the truth even if your voice shakes. I imagine Rahab answering the door that night, knowing that her life was on the line because the spies were on the roof. May you find deep courage like this woman from a story a long time ago.